Well, I'm going to try and deal with some wider questions. What is science, if you like,
Yeah.
and how do we form our views about the world? Because I think that's what's been coming out of this discussion more than the specifics of climate. I'm not an expert on that. I can only debate at the level that we've seen just a few minutes ago. But what is a healthy skepticism? What is a critical attitude? That's what I'd like to try and delve into, and how you maintain that, regardless of what general opinion thinks. And then Piers will be up here a little bit later on, and he'll do his talk on the specifics of certain aspects. So that's what I was thinking about my thematic today. I was actually waiting for Kyle to come over and get us going. Where's he going? Oh, Kyle, come and join us. It was around these thematics I wanted to try and discuss. Not to try and catch you out or anything like that.
Is that Julian Assange?
It's from Elisa here, so she wanted to put it there.
Thank you so much.
It's actually not from
I think
Elisa,
you
it's
should
from another
speak about
friend.
him. 50 weeks in prison that man has gotten. 50
He's
weeks.
spent a lot more than that, hasn't he? He's spent forever in prison. at the moment.
7 years in the embassy.
For skipping bail. The maximum sentence you can get for skipping bail.
A little bit of water. Right, are we set? Are we set? You're right.
But really, it's for telling the truth about the American Empire.
Funny how the world's changed that we ask these questions first of all, but anyway. So anyway, we were discussing, and what I said was, he said, am I going to discuss climate change? Well, not really, but yes. Because I'm going to discuss what I think is how you develop a healthy skepticism and a critical mind towards questions that sometimes might seem overwhelmingly true. And I can talk about some of those, my personal experience about these questions, and then I'll try and extrapolate that and extend that towards wider questions in the world. And I think we can engage in a reasonable debate. And I'm not claiming to be the expert on scientific method, but I know what I know, and I'll talk about that. So, starting from this question about the climate discussion, I have heard arguments from both camps. In the last 2 weeks, I've spent more time studying this question than I've spent in the whole of my life. And so I'm no means an expert on the subject, but I've watched quite a few YouTube videos and lectures from the people who supposedly know. And I've looked into articles, not sufficient academic articles, I must say that, because one of the peculiarities from having studied at university and finished my PhD last year was that I know that there's even to this day, there are the plebs and there are the people who are considered on the inside of the intellectual world. So if you're signed into a university and you're registered at university, you have access to documentation from scientific publishing houses, social sciences, natural sciences, culture, literature and so on, the majority of which is published and only made available to those with access to those databases. And they aren't open databases. They're closed databases with a paywall behind them. So just the same as if you want to access, nowadays, you want to access the Times newspaper, even parts of the Independent or the Financial Times, you have to pay money to get through the paywall to read just them. It didn't used to be that. A few years ago, all of them were open. Now they've closed themselves off. It's the enclosure of knowledge. And then you've also got, in the universities, like I said, nearly all scientific research is behind paywalls. So when they say to you, this is a proviso first of all, if anybody says to you, the scientists have said this, the scientific consensus is this, it's not possible for you to check, because you are not granted, as a normal citizen, access to those scientific papers. You are granted access to some papers, those that are prepared to publish them, which can certainly occupy all your time, I'm sure, at least in relation to climate science, as they call it.
That's not true.
What?
None of this is true. The science.
What isn't true?
Science on climate change is accessible
by any scientist. You can get the papers. This notion, which this is the defence of Jeremy Corbyn's brother, who's nothing other than a crank.
It's not a defence of anything.
Right, it is.
I'm talking. Well, you literally,
Science
James.
is an
I was
open-
standing here 5 minutes ago. I noticed you walk over about 1 minute ago, and you immediately jumped in as if you knew what I'd been talking about.
Heiko,
You didn't
he's
know
right.
what I'd been talking about.
Heiko, he's right.
Sorry?
I have spies in this meeting.
You didn't know what I was talking about. So
hills of-
why don't you just wait for a couple of minutes to hear what I'm actually saying,
Heiko,
rather than assume you know what I'm saying?
I hate to agree with him, but he's right. Heiko,
I
anyone-
said-
Scientific papers are not accessible.
I said
They are
the
accessible.
majority of
You can
scientific
go to the
papers.
library. You can read them in the library. Most.
What?
You can get Nature, the most important science journal on the
Nature is
planet. You can
a
read it-
journal.
Scientific American.
You can read that in any
A journal.
any good university
And there are
library
scientific
or any
libraries.
good
Some-
public
some
library.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's true.
You
But
believe in climate
The
change?
overwhelming
It's not a belief
majority.
system, madam. Science
yeah,
is a matter
the
of
thing is, the
fact.
natural world
The
doesn't care if you
overwhelming-
believe in it.
You believe in it.
Hang on.
It's a matter of fact.
Yeah, but does it
He
matter?
does. He does. believe
Does
it.
it matter what he
Climate
believes or
change
doesn't
is a
believe?
great hoax, and carbon taxes are being
Yeah,
now
so
forced
says the
on the
Pope.
Irish people. You, God protects, you're a Catholic. You
It's a
know
British
God
plot.
protects the planet.
It's a British plot, everybody.
Jesus Christ is a hoax. Jesus Christ is a hoax. He was water skiing. He was water skiing.
There are a lot of secondary
You're not allowed to
research
blaspheme.
papers
By the way, church is that
About
way.
what?
summarize
About what?
that summarize the
No, they just
existing
come from the
scientific
Catholic meeting. They were,
literature in
you
all
know,
Well,
areas.
There are,
Their knees were twitching.
but
They
that's
wanted to sort of get down
summarising.
on their knees.
That's not allowing members of the public who do not have access to those paywall
Oh, you can go to the
scientific
library.
documents.
Just go to the
In
library.
the library, they are not available, my
You can get
friend.
you can get journals like Nature at the
Look,
library.
I have just finished my PhD. Since I finished my PhD, I no longer have access to the documents, the cutting-edge documents on the scientific or on the political or economic questions
this is a
that
problem.
I studied.
This is not a
That's
problem.
what I know.
This doesn't mean that climate change is not happening.
I didn't. I told you I'm not talking
That
about
it's-
that
that it's not
subject.
man-made.
I'm talking about. You see, again. Firstly, we're talking about method. I said to you before I began this discussion, I am not actually talking here about climate change. I'm talking about what constitutes the formation of opinion, critical thinking,
Do you accept climate
and
change?
knowledge.
Do you accept the Labour Party policy on climate change?
I don't. No.
Oh, okay.
I don't.
So there we are.
I
So
don't.
you are, in a roundabout way, trying to defend Jeremy Corbyn's brother.
Jeremy
who is a
Corbyn's brother will
crank.
be here in a few minutes to talk for
Oh,
himself.
brilliant.
Right? So you can deal with him then. I am not being Jeremy Corbyn's brother. I am me. I am arguing about what I think I know. That's all I'm trying to do.
From the last 2
And what-
weeks, you said, listen, you,
On that specific subject, in the last 2 weeks, and that's why I'm not
have you
talking
asked
about
any- have
it.
you gone
That's
to-
why I'm not talking about it as my primary
have
subject.
you emailed any scientists
I-
and asked them what they think?
I said that's why I'm not talking about it as my primary subject.
Information freedom is important, but a more important topic is climate change, and you should talk about that.
I don't mind talking about it within the parameters of what I know, which is very little.
But you know that the
So
scientific consensus.
what I do,
You,
so
do you know how
this is what I'm interested in. When I hear people say to me, and I have said, and I'll repeat again for those of you who want to believe something else, I'll repeat it once again. On the question of man-made climate change, I am agnostic. Right? I'm not agnostic in relation to the existence of God. I'm an atheist.
After
There is a
30 years of
distinction.
solid science, you're agnostic.
The gentleman, because what I hear is something different to what is argued. What I hear is what you're saying. I see people on television. I see people arguing on the demonstration over here. What they say to me is, the scientific consensus says this. And I say to them, I don't care what the scientific consensus says. I am not swayed in my opinions by what a majority of scientists think. In fact, I think that's a foolish an unscientific method of approach to any question.
No, your argument is foolish. All you're basically telling us is you're an
What
outsider
is
that will never
science?
accept a consensus in anything, whether it's science, whether it's who's going to win the league, or whatever. You're just an outsider who takes a contrary view.
Now,
That's all you're telling
I
us.
will admit, in relation to what James is saying, that I have spent my adult life questioning. And when I've been questioning, I've ended up in what most people would consider to be minority viewpoints. And so I don't deny that I have a certain sympathy for a number of minority viewpoints. Let me give you an example. I consider myself to be a Marxist, and within Marxism,
Which is a non-scientific
And-
position.
well, I'll discuss that in a minute. Within Marxism, Marxism claims
Claims,
to be a science.
but it's not accepted.
But
as
the
such
word
by the
science in
community,
German,
correct?
this is lost in translation. The word
Wissenschaft?
science, yeah, it's a different. They use the word science in a different way than English speaking.
Well,
people
but
use it.
Karl Marx and
I don't-
Friedrich Engels
I don't-
lived in London for most of their lives. They were perfectly familiar with the English language, and they were quite happy to use the word scientific socialism to describe their philosophy.
But he never submitted
But it
any
was a
scientific
philosophy.
papers to any scientific institution.
Social science.
At
That's
the
a very
time.
interesting point.
Right.
Social
right.
That's a
sciences
very.
are not
Let
as
me
verifiable.
try and respond to
He rather
what James
decided,
just said.
like you do, that he has a
James
contrary
has just
opinion
made an
that was
interesting
correct
point.
without it being tested.
James has just made an interesting point, and this is what we hear in relation to the debate about climate change. And that is that they will say, oh, well, a lot of these people have not subjected their research papers to peer review. Now, that's perfectly true. I, for example, last week submitted a document for peer review to a university publication.
You submitted it to Pierre Corbyn. That's what you mean by peer review.
It was submitted to the University College London, a School of East European and Slavonic Studies, right, for a book they're publishing this year.
University.
However, the peer reviews I got, I found incorrect, misdirected, and misunderstanding what I had written. It did force me to amend some of what I'd written, because otherwise they would have rejected the paper. But I've had a friend, for example, who takes the same view on my core subject of competence, that is Chinese political economy. A friend of mine took the same view as me on Chinese political economy, and she's studying at the School of Oriental and African Studies, doing her PhD. And one professor turned around to her and said, if you continue to argue the position you're arguing, I will not accept you as my supervisor. So in other words, rather than debate the issues, because the professor decides they do not agree with that viewpoint, they can block someone from studying a field.
There's another way of
Let me
looking
give
at
an
that.
example of how that works.
There's another way of looking at that. That is, the particular supervisor you had may have recognised that what you were writing about
incredibly
was
verified.
either outside or towards the edge of their competence.
That wasn't me this was talking about. In my particular field, my professor was quite happy to supervise my studies, even though my analysis of China was fundamentally in contradiction to his. He was quite happy to continue accepting my research and to promote my research. That I consider to be an open and critical mindset in relation to the development of knowledge. A PhD, a doctorate, is supposed to mean, this is the definition of what it is a unique contribution to human knowledge. That's what the precondition for getting a PhD is. However, when you go and study a PhD, a lot of times they will have classes where they teach the first year PhD students about what it is they're doing. And they will say to them, and I attended myself at King's College, they will say to the students, well, although you're supposed to make a unique contribution to human knowledge, we accept this is rather difficult. And therefore, we are often prepared to stretch the parameters of that to a criticism of someone else's work. So in other words, the definitional determinant that is supposed to decide what is critical thinking and a unique contribution to human knowledge is basically ignored. That's in key institutions that are supposed to be at the very top. King's College, for example, my college, a couple of years ago was registered as the #1 university for research in the world. And yet, this mentality exists amongst many people within the parameters of the university. Now let's go further.
And social sciences, yeah.
Not only in the social sciences, my friend.
How should the world be?
Critical thinking does not mean that you accept the consensus. Let me give you an example of this. I know I mentioned it earlier on, but it wasn't in front of the camera or in front of the audience.
I think you've had your brain scrambled by the Koch brothers. All this bad science that's been given out, you know.
What are you talking about?
They've been funding.
I just spent 8 years preparing my PhD.
Listen, what applies
The
to social,
overwhelming
it's a false
majority,
analogy,
the
because the
overwhelming.
social sciences are not the natural
Well, I will
sciences.
come on to natural
It's not the
science in a
same
minute.
thing.
The overwhelming majority of research on Chinese studies in economics, in politics, in sociology, psychology, organizational studies, managerial studies, the overwhelming majority of research in these fields contradicts the arguments I was making. And the overwhelming majority of departments of universities like that would never contemplate employing someone like myself, because my viewpoint is so sharply at odds with theirs.
You cleaned up your
So
Twitter account yet?
it's not such a strange phenomenon that cannot be extrapolated to other
it's a false-
spheres.
it
Let me
is.
give you an example.
It's a false analogy.
It's not a false analogy. I'll tell you why.
Confronted by a retweet.
In relation to, for example, I will be interviewing this man tomorrow. I read this book several years ago. And I've spoken about this book at Speaker's Corner in the past. This book is called The Big Bang Never Happened. Now, there are also a couple of books called The Big Bang Never Happened that are Christian books. This is not a Christian
That's
book.
not a controversial opinion, by the way.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's very heatedly
About
debated.
the universe. One, the Big Bang, and the other, which was generated by a Catholic priest, and the other is steady state.
Well, that's not the only thing. It's not the
I was
only
going to say,
theory. Steady
you're making
state.
out that there's a huge scientific consensus
only
on
two
this.
main-
There is an overwhelming scientific consensus that the universe was created from a singularity in a Big Bang. The overwhelming consensus in science is that.
That's right. And there's
Now,
evidence to back it.
you don't have to agree with Eric Lerner's theory or Hannes Alphin's theory about this, that the universe has existed for all time and is in constant motion and constant change.
Steady state.
In order, not steady state, in order to understand a plasma universe is what he puts forward actually, not steady state. However, you don't have to agree with that, but what you'll find is, and what the evidence is presented here is that if you don't agree with the Big Bang theory,
Yep.
you are refused access to telescope time. And there are only certain telescopes in the world that allow you actually to delve into the wonders of the universe.
That's a problem.
And therefore, by restricting access to telescope time, you restrict access of those critical thinkers of that fundamental question to provide, to analyse the data and provide contrarian evidence to the dominant theory.
This is a
But that
problem.
could
Now,
simply
you will
be-
have seen also
That could simply be a shortage of time,
Yeah.
24 hours
That's
a
the
day.
problem.
You're
Exactly.
choosing to
My
see
friend,
that as
that's-
a way
that's not
of
so strange
editing
though, is
out
it?
controversial opinions
Well-
or censorship.
Well, it is a censorship. It's a type of censorship.
Not really.
Is it?
It is.
I don't think it is.
It is, because you're saying, if you agree with the dominant theory, we will give you resources and access to study
So you're saying
materials.
no one who
If
believes
you're-
in steady state
I
gets
didn't
access
say
to
no one.
This is a problem
Why
of there not being
falsify
enough
what I said?
telescopes.
Why falsify what I said?
There's not enough telescopes. That's the problem.
So,
That's really the problem.
then there is the
That's
question.
the real problem. Not enough
Is there
telescopes.
re-
We
are
should
there-
build more telescopes.
Now, you said earlier on,
Get the Chinese to build
correct
that
me if I'm wrong, I
There's
don't want to
not enough-
misquote you. You said earlier on, rejecting the dominant theory on climate science
Sorry, can I have a quick
should be, what did you say?
Just have a quick
Well,
I mean, when the
trying to-
BBC has a climate denier or a person denying man-made climate change on their show, debating a scientist, climate scientist, or both of them are scientists, but they give the impression that actually there's this big debate going on. That's, there's a lot of uncertainty when there isn't. The fact is that there is very definite certainty that climate change is happening. It's caused by human beings burning carbon, and it can be reversed by governments taking action.
Well,
That's a widespread basic assumption. That's what's happening.
That's a widespread assumption.
This debate in a rational world would not happen. What we're doing right now, it just wouldn't happen.
What do you mean? We're not rational?
Rational-minded people
We're
like
not
yourself
rational.
wouldn't waste time.
Speaker's Corner is just loonies.
Rational-minded people like yourself.
What are you doing here then?
Well, it's not just loonies. There's a vast potential here for rational discussion. And
But
you're
that
thwarting
cannot be discussed.
I'm thwarting-
We can have here discussions on Christianity, on Islam, on varieties of Islam, on varieties of Christianity, on atheism, on economics, on politics, but we cannot discuss climate change.
You can discuss. Of course, you can talk about.
Let me
whatever you
start
want.
with the following,
you
which
just-
I said earlier on. My concern starts with the terminology. The terminology climate change. What on earth does that mean?
It means the
The
climate's
very
changing.
term, you see, I am a Marxist, and as a Marxist, I accept the philosophy which is called dialectical materialism. And dialectical materialism comes from Heiko, from Feuerbach, and other materialists.
Aristotle.
And basically, what we argue is that everything that exists is in constant process of change. Everything in the universe is in a constant process of change.
Yeah, man.
There is nothing in the universe that exists that does not change.
What about fundamental laws like F equals MA?
Sorry?
What about fundamental laws like F equals MA?
Like,
F equals
No,
MA.
that's a provisional truth.
Now,
that's what
The
scientists
gentleman
claim.
here basically is saying a formula. What about a fundamental formula? Here is a fundamental formula.
It's not a fundamental.
All human beings will die.
What about the
Here is a formula. All human beings will die.
what about the ratio?
Yes,
between
correct.
diameter and
What is not a formula is all human beings will die if we don't change X, Y, and Z in 12 years' time, which is what these lunatics are arguing.
Lunatics now.
They are
They're
lunatics in this
lunatics.
respect.
Ad hominem.
Lunatics.
Don't use ad
The
hominem.
argument that the world will end if we don't do X, Y, and Z to carbon within 12
That
years.
is not the claim.
It actually could be shorter than
That is not the claim.
The gentleman is saying that Greta Thunberg said that.
That's not the claim.
The IPCC says that. What does it actually
Run
mean?
away- run away
Let me
climate
ask you this, what the consequence of that argument is. It is the argument of a death cult. It's the argument worse than a death cult because it says the entire planet, all life on Earth,
But it's Labour Party policy.
all life on Earth
It's Labour
will be
Party
destroyed if we don't do what they demand
That's actually
within
not what that
12
says.
years.
Watch the video on.
Ask yourself this, following.
It's a caricature. It's a caricature.
Ask yourself the following.
Propaganda caricature.
If in 6 years' time we have not done that, and today, if there's 12 years, 11 something now, but if there's 11 something now, nearly 12, and you've got the right to blockade London, close down Heathrow Airport, and so on, in 6 years' time, what right do you have then?
But you're not really
To
attacking
blow
the
up
truth.
Heathrow Airport?
You're not really attacking the
It's a
truth of that
slippery
claim.
Can you have the right to blow up Heathrow Airport?
It's
You're not
irrelevant. That's
attacking the
irrelevant.
truth of
Is
the
it?
claim.
Not only is it
Do
irrelevant.
you have the right to kill others who don't agree with you?
That's a
You're
separate
annoyed
problem.
that they're
That's a separate
protesting.
issue.
No, I'm talking about the psychology.
Tory Westminster.
Here we're not dealing with science.
They're strictly
We're
non-violent.
dealing with a date set arbitrarily by a group of people claiming to be scientists, claiming to have scientific justification, inventing a very specific date
expected more.
based on a particular mathematical model churned into a computer, churned out of a machine, and then demanded of the population that they comply with their computer model. That's what the 12-year figure is.
Actually, can I tell you something? The United
I'd prefer David Bowie's 5 years, that's all we've
That's
got,
not science.
to 12 years, you're going to die in 12 years unless you obey me.
That's not what they've said. Heiko, and in
That's
fact-
what they're saying. So tell me about what's wrong with what I've just said.
First,
Tell me, those of you who agree with those arguments, tell me what's wrong with it.
what the United Nations did was they looked at all the different claims about climate change
I know.
and when runaway climate change was going to begin,
Run away, yeah.
and they collated all that information together.
Firstly, let's get this straight for this meeting. We are not discussing climate change. Climate is in a permanent process of change like everything else in the universe. So the term is utterly meaningless.
All right, let's talk about
If you're saying global warming,
anthropogenic global warming.
right, now I accept you can use that term, anthropogenic
semantics.
global warming.
It's
It's a
semantics.
verifiable and negatable theory, right? Otherwise it's meaningless. You are saying anthropogenic, man-made,
Climate change.
man-made what?
Global warming.
Global
I said it's
warming,
more
he
than-
said.
Do you know why? Do you know why it's called
Global
climate
warming.
change?
You could also,
why they
hang
have
on,
it
hang
called
on.
global
You
warming?
could also say man-made climate.
Change.
Climate.
Changing of the
It's
climate.
actually
You're saying,
it doesn't
you're
matter
saying
what the-
man-driven climate change.
the process
about women?
doesn't care what you call about it.
Man or women.
The process doesn't care what you
So
call it.
human
It's going to happen.
changes to the climate.
Yeah.
Can I just say,
Right.
you talk about death cults.
Which is not climate
So-
change,
when the-
it's human-made changes.
Well, we call the climate
The 12 year
However-
figure, the 12-year figure is actually incredibly conservative. It could be a
So
lot.
the
sooner.
gentleman here is saying it might be less than 12 years.
Yeah, because the
so
United.
Kyle
let me explain
here,
why. Let me explain
and
why.
Kyle, hang on, Kyle was heavily involved in Extinction Rebellion.
Oh,
was,
dear.
yeah.
Were you?
No, don't have a go at him because of it. He was. Now, he therefore is arguing
Could be less
right
than
in
United
line
Nations.
with what these people were saying the other day.
Yeah.
So I'm not wrong when I'm saying
Yeah.
that they gave a 12-year period,
But,
right?
No, but what did they
Am
say?
I wrong?
They were quoting the United Nations. The United
Okay,
Nations
good.
last year came
I
out
hope
with a
they've got
report
something to quote.
saying that after collating all the different climate reports together, as many as we could, we've come to the realization it's actually not only, it's worse than we thought, but we have 12 years to prevent, roughly 12 years to prevent
Roughly.
runaway climate change.
How roughly?
After which point,
So I'm not wrong in
it
what I
won't
said.
matter whether or not we take. Can I
If you
finish my
accept
point?
that argument,
Can I respond?
sorry,
I'm not
There is
finished.
a margin of error.
Can I respond?
Hang on, hang on.
It's actually,
It's not a comedy item, by the
it's
way.
actually a lot. It's probably worse than that.
Think of your children.
Okay.
It's actually probably worse than that. They are.
I'm all for
The
extinction.
United Nations is probably being overly conservative, because when you collate a lot of information together, you're more likely to be careful and not as radical. And also, a lot of the organizations, they have what's called scientific. They've got to be very academic and not basically try and scare people. They don't want to be alarmist. However, they should be alarmist. You should be all very alarmed. You may not have a future in 20 years' time from now.
I've seen
This country listen, this country is predicted to have numerous coastal cities that are flooded because of climate change. It's already starting to happen.
I've seen Greta Thunberg speak. I've seen, I can't remember the name of the guy behind the organisation called There's No Time Left. And he discovered Greta Thunberg and promoted her first of all. I've seen also many other, the guy called Roger Hallam, sorry. And I saw him on the telly and he was saying, we are the world's fire alarm. Right? And Greta Thunberg says,
But you're deaf.
your house is on fire, what can you do?
Yeah. Where
Right?
did she get that
So
from?
in other words, well, some other people wrote that for her, but anyway,
Exactly.
she always says the same thing, right? Now, I understand some people like to stay on message. You know, Alistair Campbell was good at that. Teach Tony Blair, stay on message.
But
So let me clarify
But
something.
even Mr. Corbyn says there's a climate crisis, but not the one that is in the news. Correct. So what is the climate crisis?
We're going to come to Piers in a few minutes.
So there is a climate crisis. Even Mr. Corbyn's climate crisis.
We'll come to Piers in a few minutes. So I ask you this. Given the fact that it's well accepted in Western democratic societies that we have such a morally good society that we have the right to intervene to stop bad
You're
behaviour.
muddying the waters.
For example, if someone is a murderer, we regard it as normal that we will arrest them and put them in prison. If someone is a mass
Except if it's a
murderer,
political
we
crime
consider
and you're
it
a Marxist
necessary
regime.
to arrest them and treat them, put them in prison, make sure they never harm anyone again. If someone runs a paedophile ring, we think they should be arrested and put away. Therefore, it would be perfectly logical, using the Western democratic legal theoretical framework, to say that if in 6 years' time we are 6 years closer to the destruction of the planet, or life on Earth potentially, if that's the case,
Human life. That's
human life then, okay, maybe scorpions will survive, I don't know. But in any case, if that is the case, that human life can be extinct as a consequence of not acting dramatically in line with the proposals made by Richard Hallen or whoever it is, then in 6 years' time, would not the climate emergency that they've demanded and Scotland's adopted,
Which the
and
Labour
many
Party
councils,
introduced
and
into
unfortunately
Parliament.
the Labour Party has also adopted,
And they voted for
would
it.
it not be justified, given the fact that it's all life on Earth we're talking about, not a bunch of kids
it wouldn't be.
affected
No,
by...
it wouldn't be.
Wouldn't be what?
Can you get to the end?
justified.
No, let him get to
To
the
do
end.
what?
He was going to get to
To
the end
do
of
what?
that. Let me finish.
Get to the end of the sentence
Yeah,
in
my-
about 2 minutes.
It's a,
The
it's
end
a-
of the
it's
sentence
a-
is
it's
what?
a rhetorical device, just
and I'm gonna-
to
I'm
let
gonna
you.
respond to
He's
it.
using
Which is
rhetorical.
what?
It's called paralactor. He's using a rhetorical device to get you to listen,
Well, so I've
because
lost-
he's going to get to the verb that will
Speak.
end that
It's
sentence.
called a speech.
Just let him finish.
It's called
Let him finish.
oratory,
It's like listening to
a
German
speech
subjects
in Hyde
the
Park.
last 2 words.
He's using a lot of clauses like a lawyer.
So
You
the
just gotta let
question
him
is
go.
this: does it then automatically follow that in 6 years' time we'd have a right, for example, to taser people? Let's say,
No.
hang on,
No.
hang on, hang
The
on,
answer
hang
for you-
on,
no.
hang
The
on,
answer is
hang
no.
on,
Hang on.
hang on,
Mr.
hang
Speaker.
on.
Let him
Have you
finish.
heard of aversion therapy?
As the man says, you should
Have you
only,
heard
you should
of
only
aversion
cross bridges
therapy?
when you come to the
Now-
bridges. That will be in 6 years' time.
Ecofascism is not necessarily what's going to happen.
G5.
It may not necessarily happen.
5G, but it better said. There's a debate in that this week in the Cabinet Office, wasn't there? Where they're discussing 5G. And 5G, basically, they're devices that you put all around the world in order for you to allow
Shocking, really.
Yes.
real-time control over fourth generation, industrial
by the
revolution
Chinese
technology.
Communist
Question,
State.
Mr. Speaker. Mr.
So
Speaker, I've
if
got a
you
question.
could
He's starting a new- he's
have a
starting new
device run through 5G that every time, for example, you do something that's negative to the environment, that you zap them with a little bit of
Yeah,
taser.
Please.
Just a little shot.
Please.
Stop it. And then, so you don't have to put them in prison. But if they still don't obey,
This is a non-expert.
1
view
year
of 5G.
before terminal destruction of the planet, surely would be possible, it would be justifiable if, say, there are 6 million people still causing these problems,
Right.
surely it would be justifiable
Right.
to put them in some sort of concentration
So
camp.
you're arguing for an authoritarian
I'm
response.
not arguing that at
yes,
all.
You are. You're
I'm
bringing
saying,
up
I said
all
earlier
kinds
on,
of what ifs, and the
first I
solution
said,
is an authoritarian
the arguments being
crackdown.
made for a 12-year deadline are the arguments of a death cult.
Why? How
Secondly,
does that prove
I
it?
back that
What
up
happens if
by
he's-
arguing,
Marxism
by
is a
showing
death
you
cult.
with a mathematical model
Fewer and fewer-
how this will develop,
promoting Marxism.
how the psychology
What happened to
associated
Marxist
with it
science?
will
What happened to
develop.
Marxist literature?
And I assure
It don't
you,
exist anymore.
Jimmy Jones and the Jonestown Massacre have nothing on the theoretical underpinning of the arguments that are being presented around the 12-year theory.
You're trying to scare us into
So
being
that's why I'm
polluted
saying
environment.
there are dangers inherent in the argument that you have made to me earlier on, which is we must believe the consensus of the scientists because they're the experts and they're telling us this is what we have to do. But if I ask you to provide the scientific evidence, you'll turn around and say, well, I know it's there. I'm actually not a scientist myself, but we must believe the scientist.
So you want me to bring a massive load
You're
of
actually
scientific-
no, you're
you
misrepresenting.
haven't
Well,
got the-
no, I want you to
hasn't got the
master.
evidence
I
that they're
want you to
wrong.
master the arguments you're defending, rather than demand that others
That's not
don't
fair.
contradict
That's not
them.
fair. That's not fair.
Look, this is a foolish argument. What you're
Where's
basically
the
saying,
foolish
it's a
argument?
foolish argument because there's no person alive knows everything. There's no person
No,
alive
but I can show you a
that
lot of
knows
people who
everything
claim
in
to
the
know a
the
lot
domain of science.
and who commit
right.
an
So in a
enormous amount
democratic
of
society,
destruction
you are
in
going
the
to
name
have
of
to
their
accept
knowledge.
some things on
Let me give you an
faith.
example. and I'll wander
You know,
off
we don't
quickly
live
onto
in the
another
middle of
taking a
a
couple of
giant
minutes.
conspiracy theory, which the
I'll
capitalists
illustrate
are,
to you
putting
why
out
my
for us.
scepticism is rooted in my own personal experience and
Yeah,
intellectual
but put
development.
aside your personal experience.
I'll
This
argue
is
that
science.
first of all,
This is
so that
science.
you can understand where I'm coming from.
Try not to have so much weight.
I have spent my adult life analysing and studying Marxist economic theory,
Which is non-scientific.
which some people say is non-scientific, and myself and other Marxists say is scientific. I'm not concerned whether you think it's scientific or not. It doesn't bother me whether you think it's
But
scientific
what
or
is the
not.
consensus on
I
that?
would never demand that you support this theory
Is it-
because it's
Is it
scientific.
50-50 or is it 99?
In fact, there were people who did this, and there still are people who do that. They are what I would call non-Marxist Marxists.
Oh, come
They
on.
are people like Joseph Stalin. He used to say, anybody doesn't agree with science of Marxism should be put in prison.
Arguments.
And that's what they did.
Well, that was for the lucky
That's
ones.
what they did in
That
the
was the lucky
Soviet
ones.
Union. If you said, I do not agree with Marxism, the science of society, they would send you to the, if you consistently
science is about that in this example.
disagree with
Science
it,
is about
they
that.
would send you to a prison camp. They would even send you to a mental institution. So what I've been saying about the use of science as a god to justify this, I can explain to you from the experience of the ideology that I support and the theories that I support, that this has been used in exactly that way in the past. And that's for the ideas I support. But then I look at the other way round. For the sake of everybody here who didn't spend their time, their misspent youth, studying Marxism, but who lived in the world that we live in here, but who were told every day on television, now for the economics expert. The economics expert comes on telly and tells you the economy is growing, the economy is in crisis, the economy is expanding, the stock market's doing
you
very
read
well,
Marx in the
the
original
British
German?
economy is doing
Did
marvellously.
you read Marx in the original German?
The people, I have read in German as
No,
well.
no, you didn't read it in the original German. You would have read modern German. So you've depended on experts for translation.
What are you talking about, modern German?
Modern German is not the same as the German that Marx
Of course
used.
it is, you
No, it
silly
isn't.
man.
No, it isn't.
Marx
on,
was in
just
1850s,
carry on, just
1860s,
carry on,
the
carry
same
on.
German.
Carry on. Don't take no.
They
Now,
don't speak,
now,
Germans don't speak Marxist German anymore.
of course they do.
No, they don't.
Come on, just leave it. Just carry
You've
on.
lost
Don't-
Kyle.
Leave it.
So the argument I'm going to make is as follows.
Score one over.
And I will
Understand
finish.
what you're-
And I will finish my argument on this.
Quite like to suck it.
I will finish my argument on this, and then Piers will come in with his arguments about
He
the
hasn't got any
scientific.
arguments. He's got a cranky theory. He's never submitted a scientific report,
arguments.
even though he says, how many?
That's his argument. Firstly,
Have they been
firstly,
And
it is me holding the meeting now. Piers will be up in a minute. You can discuss with him then. We can discuss with you'll discuss in a minute. It's not the discussion now.
that was in 1870.
nothing.
Don't waste your time, Piers. Please. Don't waste your time with that. You
I
just
know.
want to drag off
I
the
know
subject.
That Marxism,
Wants to
according
drag off the
Karl
subject
Popper,
now.
is bunkum.
The argument I make is as follows,
An ex-Marxist.
and all of you will be familiar with this. You don't need to be a Marxist to know what I'm saying is true, and that is the geniuses in economics departments at universities, the professors, the Nobel Prize winners, the heads of the World Bank, the heads of the IMF, the heads of Barclays Bank, the heads of Lloyds Bank, the financial gurus of the world, and the economics gurus of the world. They did not predict and could not understand and have not resolved the economic crisis that emerged in 2008 to 2009. With all the computing power in the world, with all the finances financing their economic research in the world, they could not predict, did not understand, and still have no resolution to what happened in 2008, 2009. I put it to
But
you,
you Marxists have the
I
answer.
put it to you that we know more about economics because it affects our everyday lives All of us are involved in economics. All of us depend on economics. We know more about that than about any other subject within the human world. And yet, at least, okay, medicine perhaps, the body itself.
Economics is just philosophy.
And yet, no major mainstream economists had any explanation for the 2008 crisis and what happened thereafter. None of them did. And the leading theoreticians of the day, they were awarded Nobel Prizes for the mathematical models they made for the algorithms of the development of the world economy. That is how we landed where we landed up. So don't tell me that climate science, knowledge of geology, oceanography,
Ecology,
of the sun,
rheumatology.
of astronomy, of cosmology, of meteorology,
Quite a lot of ologies there.
of all of these spheres put together, that we know more about them than we know about economics. I do not believe it.
Yeah, we don't know
But if
anything.
someone can convince me, I'm
This
open
guy-
to convincing.
Well, this guy, he knows
But
all
I
the
do not
answers.
believe
Come on.
it.
So you're just a warm-up back for the crank, so
Yeah.
let's get him on.
Come on.
So
Come on, Piers, talk shit
now
about it.
Piers is going to talk. I discussed with Piers earlier. He's going to talk about what he believes
Are we going back to primary school?
drives the climate, and it is going to be
That
a
would help,
talk.
wouldn't
Sorry, what did you want to say? What did you want to say?
Oh, I wasn't talking to her, to you. I was talking to her.
I thought you were disagreeing with the arguments. You looked at sounded like a skeptical.
Couldn't hear the argument. We couldn't hear what you were arguing.
Couldn't.
No, you're just talking about economics, and now you're pivoting. It's a confused metaphor.
Well, the economics metaphor is because this is something that we live with every day. Economics,
CS2 is
and I
plus of
argued.
life.
I
Bloody
argued.
hell.
That's
You,
how
you
it
don't.
is. There's
You
a
don't
spelling
want to
mistake.
listen. You mean?
No, I'm listening.
You are listening, or you don't want to listen.
I was trying to see what the sign said as well.
That's a Eurocentric
So,
map of the world.
so you did
Look at
understand
the
what I
size
was
of America.
arguing, or you didn't.
Look at the
If you
size
didn't
of
understand, I'll
Africa.
repeat
That's
it. But if you
Eurocentric.
don't want to
It's
understand it, I'll stop.
imperialistic. It's an imperialistic map of the world.
The main message.
The jump to the main message was. The jump to the main message was.
This is accurate for area.
Understanding science is not based on consensus viewpoints.
the jet stream?
Understanding science has nothing to do with consensus.
Okay.
Science is about facts,
Yes.
is about analysis,
Still there.
is about frameworks for understanding things.
That discounts Marxism.
Now, some people would argue Marxism is not a science. I believe Marxism is a
Karl
science.
Popper, an
right?
ex-Marxist. Go and read him. Have you read Karl Popper?
I have read Karl Popper, yes.
Karl Popper is
And
very
what Karl Popper says is relevant to this discussion because what he says is, and that's fundamental to this argument that's being put, that consensus of scientific community means you can't discuss it. Karl Popper said, that's what Kyle said earlier on.
Karl Popper
What do you
put
say?
forward the falsification
We must
theory of
believe it
scientific
because
evidence.
it's the scientific
No,
consensus.
if they say the house
Mr.
is on
Corbyn
fire,
knows what
you don't
Karl
say,
Popper
let's go in the
said.
dining room. and
Houses on fire is irrelevant.
No,
Houses
it's
on
incredible.
fire is a
It's
manipulation.
It's
Houses on fire is a psychological social engineering trick to manipulate the minds of the population.
the young.
It means go into a panic, do not think, accept what you're told. That's what it means. Now,
Marx
it's
wasn't
nothing
even
to do
a
with
scientist
science.
by the
That's
definition
nothing
of
to do with
science
science.
in the 19th
Karl
century
Popper
when he
said,
lived.
coming on to what you said, and I'll
never
finish on
submitted
that.
any papers
Karl
to any
Popper said,
And he
a
died
scientific,
with incomplete theory.
a scientific theory must be refutable. It must know what its inner refutation is. Falsifiable. In other words, just like Einstein said, you can have a million theories about science, and it only takes one item of
So how
data
would
to
we-
destroy it all.
How would we start
So
to
that is the
falsify
reason
Marxist
why.
theories?
That is the
Can't
reason
even
why.
start it. It's
That
not
is
even
the
in
reason why.
Definition of
Heckling
falsifiable.
me in the way you've been doing, arguing as Kyle did,
Religion.
or screaming about house on fire,
Secular
even
religion.
if you were 1,000% correct, would not be a correct method of approaching the
But sir,
discussion.
actually, you are the one
That's
that's
the
employing
issue I was
rhetoric
discussing.
to be the
Religion
most
is
alarmist.
I started
You are
this
the one who is
meeting-
being
Who are
most
addicted
alarmist.
to
I
a new
started
religion
this
called
meeting.
While still active.
I started this meeting with an explanation as to what the parameters of my argument would be. And that was, just to repeat as I finish, I said, I am concerned at this meeting, my meeting, not Piers's, with what constitutes the method by which you study facts, data and evidence, and how you decide whether something is true or not. And that is what I've been concerned with in the present meeting.
That's really is a discussion about science, really.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, okay.
That's what I've been discussing.
But I've seen you on Content Over Everything. They've got it on the front page. Well, you're like criticising the Extinct Rebellion movement.
Sorry, this
Yes.
is
What's wrong with that?
What's wrong with that?
Speaker's
Do you not
corner,
agree that
mime corner.
if they do believe in this
Mime corner's
model
over there.
whereby that
No.
they believe
Yeah,
there
it's
is
in the
only
middle of the
10,
four lanes.
11
I just
Told
told
who
you.
believes
I've just told
in your
you.
village.
Let me clarify to you again.
Go for it.
Just from
Go
my
for
own point of
pork.
view.
Yeah.
I was active in a Marxist tendency.
You even
Let me try and explain to
go
you.
on.
You'll find it
The
interesting.
truth hurts, huh?
I was active in a Marxist group since I was 17 years of age.
You're a conservative. You never rebelled against your family. Did you? You're a conservative. You were born up in a Marxist family, and you're a
I
conservative.
wasn't brought up in a Marxist
rebelled
family.
against my
My
conservative
father was a
I became
conservative.
a member of the
My
Labour
father
Party.
was a
You're
conservative. My father was a conservative. My mother not, but she wasn't a revolutionary.
They were
She never
Marxists.
studied Marxism,
They were
and my
Marxists.
father never studied Marxism.
They weren't Marxists.
They weren't Marxists. Well, you heard wrong. Try asking me if you want to know about me. I might tell you the truth. You never know. So, how are you?
Lecture at Portsmouth, didn't you? You listened to your lecture at Portsmouth.
I actually got involved in politics before then, but nevertheless. Now, a final point being this. You were asking me about this, I'll answer you. I said the argument of 12 years made by Extinction Rebellion is the argument of a death cult. And I told you why I argued that. Now let me explain to you how I see that. Because I've had the same mindset. I've had that mindset. I've had that mindset. I used to be in a political group. And we used to be told by the leader of that political group throughout my adult life, from 17 years of age, the leader of that group, who was a personal friend of mine, I'm explaining to you, try and listen to what I'm going to say. He used to say, I'm not. He used to say, and he used to end his speeches like this. He'd make a speech about revolution, and then he'd end his speech and say, and comrades, in 5, 10 or 15 years, we will lead the British Revolution. And the British Revolution in 5, 10 or 15 years will spark the world revolution. And then we will live in communism. That's what he used to say. 5, 10 or 15 years. I was in that tendency for 30 years. I learned no longer to say that. I learned no longer to say that. And the reason he said 5, 10 and 15 years was because it was a social engineering methodology. And that was that if I believed as a 17-year-old that in 15 years at the maximum the world revolution would happen, I would dedicate my life to achieve that. I would spend my waking hours struggling to achieve that. I still do that, but I no longer believe 5, 10 or 15 years. And if it happens in 5, 10 or 15 generations, I'd be quite happy. So that's why I say, because I worked, and basically the methodology of arguing like that creates the mindset of a cult. That's why I say to you, they are arguing the ideas of a death cult. That's what they're arguing. Oh, you again.
We spoke last week.
Did you not look on YouTube at how many people called you a frigging idiot? It was overwhelming.
Hold on a second. So you're going with a consensus now, are you?
And it
No,
also,
I'm just asking him if he looked at the consensus.
You've gone with a consensus.
I don't
Heiko,
like him being embarrassed about
Heiko,
himself.
No, why are you
Know what I
going
mean?
with a consensus?
I like him to wake up in the morning, look in the mirror and
Heiko,
say,
I'm a-
Joseph and Joseph.
Heiko,
How are you?
I'm a
Good.
big lad. I'm a big lad. You don't
Instead
need to
of
worry
this-
about me. You don't need to worry about me. But I messaged you online and sent you the paper which
I
Karl Marx
replied
wrote
to you,
on the
didn't I?
Jewish. Yes,
Did I
you
reply
told
to
these
you?
people that I
Did I
hadn't
reply?
sent you.
Did I reply
You said
to
you
you?
wouldn't debate me on it because it's not your area. I can
I
read
said I don't
exactly
wanna-
what you've said. I
Oh,
can read.
fuck's sake, what is my
on,
personal
free
Okay, so
what
just
is
for,
my personal
for those
messaging
that weren't
with this
here,
guy
for those
got to
that
do with
weren't
the
here
audience?
last week,
What has it got to do with it?
Karl Marx
So
wrote
in other
the
words,
paper.
you didn't
Karl
write to me.
Marx-
You didn't write to me to
Karl
ask
Marx-
me.
Karl Marx
Read
wrote
out
a paper
the whole thing you
called
said.
The Jewish Question. Absolutely, I'll read it all.
And what?
But just-
And what?
Just for the,
And what?
Just for the.
And what? I said I'm happy to debate that with you. What's the problem?
Online? You said no, it's not your area. You'd rather debate.
No, you want to discuss anti-Semitism.
Yes, that's what I'm doing.
You don't want to discuss Marx's work.
This is
you
what-
want to discuss anti-Semitism.
Okay, Karl Marx was
How
anti-Semitism.
much anti-Semitism can the population
How-
take?
Look at how he
they
look at how the anti-racist look at how the anti-racist trivialises
What's wrong with a
anti-Semitism.
bit of anti-Semitism?
Every time I turn on the
Listen
television,
to how the far left trivialise anti-Semitism.
And I said, that
You're
subject,
obsessed with anti-Semitism.
that subject is not my field of competence. If you want me to discuss
You're
Karl
worried about
Marx,
anti-Semitism.
I'm happy to do it.
What about all the-
You want me to
Okay,
discuss
What
anti-Semitism?
about all the prejudice
It's not
you
my
have
field
against
of
people who
competence.
make your
That's
clothes?
what I said.
Karl
That's
Marx
what I
is
said.
anti-Semitism.
Well, that's what you said. I haven't read the document yet.
And I sent it to you, and you
I
told these
said,
people I hadn't.
I said, I did not tell them you hadn't.
Oh,
did I
he
say that to?
said he hadn't. Okay, sorry.
All right, thank you very much. Suck that one back and swallow
I'm
it.
happy to take that back. So, Heiko, why didn't you read the paper that I sent you?
I'm sorry, I don't run around according to your frigging timetable.
You follow
I've got a
Karl
life
Marx.
to live, my
Karl
friend.
Marx was a fascist. You follow him. He said this about the Jews. He said,
Oh,
what
look,
is the secular...
You said you would discuss this when I've read
What
the
is
document.
the worldly
Now you're
religion of
saying,
the Jew?
whenever you send me a document,
What is
I've
the
got to
worldly
read it the
religion
moment you send it to me.
of money?
No, I am not your slave.
Heiko,
You're not
There
talking
are-
about
however,
anti-Semitism.
a word of
We're
advice.
not talking
A
about
word of advice.
anti-Semitism here. Come on, stop
A word
it,
of
seriously.
advice.
We're talking about something
If you
different.
want to have a slave,
The
if you
agenda
want-
is open.
if you
It's not
want
for
to have
you
a
to edit it.
slave, I saw a telephone
By the way,
box
you're
down the
getting a
road. There was
sugar
a
high,
sign
so,
in the
you know,
window. It said slave.
So you
I
refuse
will
to
be
debate
your
Jews on
slave.
anti-Semitism.
I will obey you.
So you refuse.
Call
So you
07722.
refuse.
Can't remember the rest of it.
So you refuse
It's
to
just
debate
down the
Jews
road
on
there.
anti-Semitism.
So there's a beautiful girl.
You propagate an
So go and
anti-Semitic
phone her up,
ideology
and you can
refuse
find
to
a
debate
slave.
it.
Me, you will not
This is
find
very
your slave.
instructive, Heiko, about
Thank you very
your
much, ladies and
attitude to
gentlemen.
anti-Semitism. Very instructive.
Very good, Susan.
Thank you very much.
Heiko's
I've got a bit of a prophet.
Your balloon's going down. There's a climate crisis. The Earth is shrinking.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Content over everything. From younger men.
Man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV.
Okay.
Listen.
We're here today with Piers Corbyn, brother of the Labour leader. He's famous for being a weather activist or weather analyst, long-range weather forecaster. And also, he's also famous as what they call a climate change denier, and he protested against Extinction Rebellion. We've got someone from Extinction Rebellion here, not an official representative, but someone who's with who was associated. We've got many other people here who've got, will no doubt have questions, ideas.